The questions that one will be asking is what can be done to change the numbers speak for themselves. Let's continue our discussion now after Michael Marile's latest numbers there. And we're still having with us this morning Jackie Musomi, a researcher from the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit. We've got Ms. Koketso Mwete, gender activist and founder of Amandla.mobi, and Daniela Casale on the line. That's associate professor at Wits University School of Economics and Finance. She's one of the authors of this NIDS cram research that's been done for what's been happening in employment in our country between February and April. And she told us a short while ago that there'll be more waves of this research, and these numbers that we're seeing currently, we must treat them as estimates. We don't know if the numbers are going to improve or they're going to paint a worse picture. 3 million South Africans out of work between February and April. 2 million of them are women. Now, Prof, you're still there, I hope, and you can hear me on the line. I want to start this segment with you. You said earlier, depending on how things are going to play out in the next few weeks or not, as the pandemic is still very much with us, things could get better or they could get worse. But we come from a history already where women have been disadvantaged even before COVID-19. So in my mind, things are not going to get better for women in this country.
Right. I mean, I think you raise a very important point, which is that women were already in a more precarious socioeconomic position pre-crisis. And this crisis has simply exacerbated those gender gaps that we always knew existed. And I think for those of us who've been tracking, gender inequality in South Africa for the last 20-odd years, it's really disappointing because, as Jackie will also tell you from the work that she's done, gender gaps were starting to go down in South Africa. Women's education has risen. Women are more likely to be working in the labour market compared to 20 years ago. Yes, the gender gap in earnings still exists, but it has shrunk slightly over the last 20 years. So, this is really disappointing that those hard-earned gains that women have seen over, decades now are being very quickly eroded. There's something else I'd like to raise, which is the income support provided by the government. In the face of this massive job loss that women are bearing the burden of, obviously the government needs to step in, and it has to provide support through the social grant system. The UIS TERF is also an important program, but keep in mind that many of the kinds of women who've lost their jobs would never have been registered on UIS in the first place. So the grant system is really key in all of this. And what we've recently learned from SASSA estimates is that even though women accounted for 2/3 of the job losses, they were only receiving 1/3 of the new COVID grants for 350 rand.
Even the benefits of our social grant system are not flowing in that number to our women in the country.
Correct. And I think what's happened is that because you cannot hold the new COVID grant for 350 rand alongside an existing grant, like the child support grant, women are being disadvantaged. And remember, that child support grant is for the benefit of the child. And just because women are looking after children, they're being disadvantaged in terms of their income support. They're not getting the new unemployment grants because they're already getting a grant for their child. But as we know, those are small values. And now, those small values and the additional top-ups don't compensate for the jobs and the income that has been lost.
I just wonder, given this picture and the plight of women in the country, if we will be able to resolve this, because it looks like we need a lot of shifts, a lot of change. And Koketso, you were pointing out earlier that there's a multiple of factors that we should be looking at. Now, if you have to take a look forward in the long term, because this is not a short-term game, as an activist, what do you think the country should be focusing on to put women in a better position?
So I think there's a set of things that need to happen, As was just mentioned, the grants are a key thing. We saw there was a backtracking. Instead of topping up per grant, it was topped up per caregiver. And in fact, women have been disadvantaged from receiving the COVID-19 grants. But actually getting money to households is very, very key at this time. It allows people to support themselves in this immediate crisis, but also moving forward. And as we know that this top up on the grants was slated to only, it's only going to happen until October, I believe, which is only for 6 months. Given that the impacts of the current crisis, which have exacerbated so much of what already existed, we're not going to get over them by October. This is long-term effect. The WHO is busy talking about it is going to take countries decades to recover. So immediate cash into households to see to their needs is going to be essential. Over and above that, protecting it is going to require serious price control. We have seen during this period that the price of basic food has increased substantially. We're looking at core staples that have gone up, by almost 30% during this period. So again, even when people are able, the inadequate support people are already receiving or non-existent support is also being further worsened by the fact these food price increases, right? Which also in itself needs to be looked at. We're talking about price controls there. We're talking about just rethinking the whole food structure and how food gets to people. Okay. So I think these are
just some of them, yeah. No. I think there's more, as you say, Kokes. Let me bring in Jackie here. Jackie, as a labor analyst, if I'm thinking about what role can organizations, companies, corporate South Africa play, because when you are looking at your workforce, and we've had Employment Equity Act in this country for a long time. It's got a gender component. But when times are tough, it looks like we are not trying to keep our professionals, professional women in jobs and also in the informal sector. They bear the brunt. What, in your view, should change in terms of the labor market? How should we address this huge disparity in our country going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So the labor market contributes more than 85% of household income. So if any change is going to come and to help this household, it needs to come from the labor market. And what we see is that people at the top of the wage distribution at the 90th percentile earn about 6 times more than the bottom 50%. And the problem is that most women are in this bottom 50%, and men happen to overrepresent the top 90%. So what needs to happen is there needs to be a change in the labor force whereby we incorporate more women in leadership positions and in top occupations in the labor market. Also, what needs to happen is that we need to evaluate how we value female labor. So it just happens that occupations that are overrepresented by women, so these are the elementary services and domestic work occupations at the bottom, are valued less compared to men at the same part of the wage distribution. So the changes that need to happen is that we need to narrow this gap between the people at the top. There is such a high premium for people with university education and above, and a low, a very high gap with people at the bottom. So we need to evaluate how do we value workers in the labor market.
So it's a question of skills as well. I just, Jackie, do you think...
There is a question of skills, but in the...
sorry, Jackie.
Sorry?
I'm saying there's a question of skills as well, which the point you're making, but sorry to cut you in there. But I'm just thinking, what we are seeing here, is it a symptom or a sign of the male dominance that we're seeing here? Is it a sign of that maybe we men in positions of authority and staff and in society, we have little trust in women leadership? But when you look around the world, countries that are led by women, like in New Zealand and Denmark, are dealing better with the coronavirus pandemic than those countries that are led by men.
Yes. That historically, South Africa is a patriarchal society where even during the apartheid era, men were assumed to be the sole breadwinners, and therefore they were paid civilized wage because the assumption was they are catering for the family. This has changed over time. So we are having more female-headed household. So that mentality also has to change. And also something that is very peculiar to South Africa is that on average, women have higher education than men. So this is really not a skill. We cannot say that women are less skilled than men. So it's a prejudice that needs to change.
It's a prejudice that needs to change. Professor, I know you do research, you do numbers, but from when you're out there in your team, and you're going to do another wave of the NIDS CREM survey, do you ask also qualitative questions that can give you a texture of what is happening?
Sorry, can you repeat that last? Did we ask what kind of questions? My sound is quite bad.
No, qualitative, not in terms of numbers. Do you also look at qualitative issues that can provide with a texture of what's really going on in our society?
Right. So that's a very good question. We have a telephone survey that cannot go beyond, on average, 20 minutes. Otherwise people get kind of quite overloaded by it. So we had to try and cram in as much, as we could in those 20 minutes to cover some of the key issues like employment, hunger, health behavior, and so on. And so we weren't able to ask all the questions we would have liked to. In this next wave, we are going to be introducing some additional questions that, as you say, try and provide a little bit more texture to what we've uncovered so far. There still can't be very detailed responses because it's difficult to record those on a phone interview. But for example, in our next wave, we're going to be asking men and women directly, has the increase in the childcare burden, since school closures, affected your ability to look for work, your ability to work long enough hours, your physical or mental well-being? We're going to be asking more of these questions directly, and many others. So, right. That's a very good point. And with each additional wave, we'll be trying to introduce more questions that are relevant and that also help us to really unpack the story further as we go ahead.
No, thank you very much. I think next time we'll discuss this topic after the next wave of your research, Professor Daniela Kasale and your colleagues, is to really have the view from the policymakers of this country. How are we going to shift this? How are we going to change this to make sure that we put more money in the hands of women? After all, they run the majority of households in this country. They take care of our children, which is our future. And I think at this stage, we are really doing a great injustice to women in our country. Thank you very much, Professor Daniela Kasale, gender activist Ms. Koketso Moeti, and labor analyst Ms. Jackie Musomi, for having been with me for the last 40 minutes or so here on eNCA. And that's it.